You're listening to Dan Rather's America.
And it's my pleasure and honor to have in the studio with us this morning Basil Hero, who's award-winning former investigative reporter with NBC News affiliates. He has a new book out, and as I said to him as he walked in today, I actually have read the book, The Mission of a Lifetime, Lessons from the Men Who Went to the Moon. It's the story of the 24 men, and there have been only 24 men, who went to the moon. That was between 1968 and 1972. The book has interviews with the 12 remaining lunar explorers, along with reflections from them and their wives on how their outlook on life was impacted by their voyages and what they hope for generations to come. He begins each chapter, and this is what I found really enlightening about the book, and many other things, but he begins each chapter with key life lessons that when you read it, you can gain from these honorable and brave men whom he calls the Eagles. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me.
Why did you decide to write this book?
I felt it was important, Dan, for the historical record to reach out to these men and women one last time. They're all in their late 80s and 90s, and I had a feeling that they would be willing to talk about some of the more philosophical and transcendental issues that other writers and authors really didn't want to discuss with them. So the notion of the common good, duty, honor, country, moral courage, how to conquer one's fears, spirituality, one's approach to God. And they really put me through the paces to make sure that I had something different to say. And when I told them, what avenues I wanted to go down, they were very excited to do so.
Well, this question may be a little too philosophical. This program, nor your narrator, is particularly noted for philosophy. But you said that when the New York Times first published a special section with quotes from world leaders about how the moon landing might change man's relationship with the cosmos, if that struck a chord with you, what was it about that piece and the fascination with what you've called the bigger story, to walk on the moon or orbit the moon?
Well, what they were coming at was where would our spiritual and universal and galactic outlook, how would that change? And you may remember, of course, Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Power of Myth.
Right.
And what he said was that all of each culture's explanation for our origins would be upended, because for the first time we would be walking on a heavenly body that had been assigned all of this great spiritual value, which really would be completely altered once they, viewed the Earth from the moon. And the overriding impression for all of them was the Earth's fragility and its smallness, and seeing it reduced to the size of a marble just rewired their brains, so that when they came back home, the three hallowed words that they all lived by, duty, honor, country, suddenly had one very important alteration to it. It became duty, honor, planet Earth. So they felt that their loyalty, the grander loyalty, was to the home planet. And they weren't seeing races, borders, countries, people, nothing from 239,000 miles out. So from the deadness of the moon, to come back to Earth, they appreciated that we are one planetary species and that we need to have a little more respect for planet Earth.
The name of the book, folks, is The Mission of a Lifetime, Lessons from the Men Who Went to the Moon. It's in your bookstore and available on Amazon and Internet, wherever you buy books now. And we're talking to its author, Basil Hero. I want to follow up on what you just said, which I hadn't thought about this in a long time. There was some talk sort of in the immediate years after the moon landing about what you've just said. It changed from duty, honor, country to duty, honor, fellow man, Earth as one. Here we are nearing the end of the second decade of the 21st century. And it's obvious there's a movement, not only in our own country, but abroad, to re-emphasize the country, duty, honor, country. In effect saying, look, it's dangerous to start thinking about one world, one people. It's the opposite of what you were just talking about.
It is, and they would argue that we have gone backwards and
that
not
is
forwards.
The men who landed on the moon.
Correct. And this is something that they're very worried about. They're no less loyal to the United States, but they see the interconnectedness of the planet. And so they're still arguing to this day that we need to think of ourselves as the collective we. So that when Mike Collins, who was on the first moon landing of Apollo 11, when they came back to the United States and did their world tour, he said that wherever they went, they kept hearing the same pronoun. It was we did it. We humanity did it, not you Americans. So there was this brief moment in history, in world history, where humanity collectively, Africa, Asia, didn't matter, South America, it was we. They want to go back to that we. They know it's difficult. They're not naive, but they think that that's the ideal that we have to strive for.
Question. We talk about the men who walked on the moon. They were all men.
Yes.
In your research, did you turn up anything that indicates that NASA even thought about sending a woman to the moon?
Well, they had contemplated it very briefly, but I think what trumped everything at that point was just the logistics of it, the space capsules, how do you have three people sharing bathroom facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it would have been culturally at that moment impossible for NASA to have put female astronauts into space. They just weren't thinking about it from a technological standpoint very carefully. The urge was always there. It's not that they didn't consider it. It wasn't that there weren't females who couldn't do the job. The time just wasn't right.
Well, as you may know with this program, or maybe not, that we have a large percentage of women who listen to this program, partly by the time of day it runs and other reasons. And I would say that the majority of them are women above age 35 or 40. And I can hear some of them saying, well, wait a minute, I may like Mr. Hero, and I like the fact we went to the moon, but this is the same old story. There were plenty of women at the time who could do the job. By the way, were there any women astronauts by that time?
No, there were not, nor were there any female test pilots. So they selected strictly from military aviators. So at that point, there were no flyers who were females. The more equally interesting issue is African Americans. There was one in particular that they had hoped to get into the program, but he didn't make it.
That he didn't make the qualifying round.
Exactly. That's right. Exactly right. Now, what is, you asked about the women. Let me just add to that I interviewed the former head of the Navy SEALs, the psychologist who sent the Bin Laden teams in there, and also the flight surgeon for NASA for 10 years, and they both arrived independently at the same conclusion, which was that the wives of the lunar explorers were in many respects braver than their husbands, simply because they were never put through simulations. No one ever, spent time with them to prepare them for what really were very dangerous missions that, in the end unnerved quite a few of the wives.
Well, I found it maybe the most interesting chapter of the book, certainly one of the most interesting chapters of the book, where you deal with the heroism of the women who were left behind while their husbands went off on this extremely dangerous mission. What did you come away with? You interviewed the women who are still living, who are wives of astronauts. What did you come away from those interviews with?
They left me with much the same impression as their husbands in terms of the common good and believing in something greater than oneself. So they took very seriously the mission and the challenge to beat the Soviet Union to the moon. But beyond that, I think there was this from their upbringing during the Depression era of believing in helping your fellow man, also your country. So they were prepared to sacrifice for that larger purpose.
That's a very good point, because they were the generation that were at least at the tail end of the Great Depression in the 30s from World War II, and they had a sense of service.
Yes, they did. And as you wrote in your book, when you were running a pipeline of water from your dad's house to the neighbors who didn't have it. So they had this sense of community, which is something I believe we have lost, and they would argue the same thing.
Well, you mentioned before that we were, and there was no question about it, we saw ourselves in a race with the Soviet Union. Looking back on it, with time and years to reflect, was it worth the money to go to the moon?
I believe it was. And there was, at the time, a very intense political debate over this, particularly with what was going on in the inner cities and the poverty that was just rampant in the United States. I think what people forget when Kennedy issued the challenge, he unleashed what really was the greatest technological and scientific revolution in American history, so that it wasn't just the 30,000 direct employees of NASA who were making that moonshot possible. It was 400,000
I just started to say it was almost 500,000.
Correct. And what's a little-known fact is that after 1972, NASA actually shared all of the technological breakthroughs in what today we would refer to as open source, sharing. And it really just unleashed the computer revolution, the revolution in communications. So I think we have to, take really almost the lunar view and say, goodness, this really was a fantastic explosion in knowledge, and I believe that continues today, and that if we do go back to the moon, it should be for the purpose of scientific exploration and all of those spin-off benefits that we couldn't even conceive of today.
This is so interesting to me, and I hope you'll come back another time. We're not quite at the end now, but the book, folks, is The Mission of a Lifetime, Lessons from the Men Who Went to the Moon. I want to talk, almost everybody in life, it's certainly been true of myself, reaches some occasions when you're afraid. You may or may not want to admit it, but you're afraid.
Sure.
And trying to overcome those fears, large or small, and they may seem small to other people if they're large to you at the moment. I'm interested in what you learned about how these men who went to the moon were able to control their emotions and overcome their very real fears.
Well, that's an excellent question. And there's this misconception that they claim was really the result of the movie The Right Stuff, which they did not like. They thought that it portrayed the astronauts as slightly daredevilish, and that was the farthest thing from the truth. What separated the winners from the losers, finally, and who got selected in the Mercury 7 was their attitude towards calculated risk. And it was a very refined attitude towards calculated risk. They were men who studied their aircraft. They had, some of them, photographic memories. They knew the blueprints, every nut and bolt. And then they practiced for every conceivable failure that they could come across. So it was preparation practice. They had all the physiological signs of fear, so that when Armstrong was making the first moon landing, his heart rate went up to 160 beats per minute.
I'm surprised it wasn't 260.
Well, certainly, absolutely. So what they did was they had an extraordinary ability to zero in on the moment. It's today what we would call mindfulness. So they immerse themselves in the moment they're in and trying to get themselves out of trouble. And that checklist that they would go through, if plan A goes south and B goes south, you've got plenty of options to keep going to. And they practiced for thousands of hours in the simulators. So it wasn't that they were fearless. They just knew how to black box their fear. And the other thing, of course, was always in the back of their minds, they said to me, and Bill Anders, who took the famous Earthrise photo, said, Basil, duty, honor, country, and the common good were really the source of our courage, and that in those words you could find a rallying spirit to be courageous.
We've got about 2 minutes left here, but I can remember my son when he was coaching my grandson in Little League Baseball. And the grandson, when he was 9 years old or something, said, I'm afraid I'm going to strike out. And his father said to him, well, remember the astronaut spirit was embrace the moment. Embrace the fear.
Exactly. And you have to do that. You have to recognize it and not ignore it, but then put it off to the side. And in their voice communications, they kept calm. So their heartbeats may have been going up, but they knew there was certainly no point in giving in to the fear or catastrophizing, the what-if kind of thinking. There was none of that in these men or in the women, actually.
We've got about a minute left. The name of the book, folks, is The Mission of a Lifetime, Lessons from the Men Who Went to the Moon. Give me a reason people should read this book.
I think it will be a source of inspiration, I think particularly for young people who may not be familiar with the lunar missions and the extraordinary accomplishment. I think that my hope is that we resurrect this notion of the common good and believing in something greater than oneself, and to get out of the tribalism that we seem to be mired in, and also to recall what Jim Lovell said to me at the end. He says, I've come to the conclusion after 50 years that we don't go to heaven when we die. We go to heaven when we are born. And it was a direct result of the lunar missions. We live in the Garden of Eden, folks, and we just haven't realized it. And there is now being taught at Yale Divinity and Harvard Divinity Schools something called eco-theology, which is a direct result of the lunar missions. And very simply, what it comes down to, if we believe that the earth is God's creation, then we have a responsibility to take care of the earth.
Basil Hero, who is the author of the new book, The Mission of a Lifetime, Lessons from the Men Who Went to the Moon, available at your bookstore or any place else you buy books. Now, Basil, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor to be here, sir.
And folks, we'll be back after first, please, these messages.